Welcome. My name is Kristin Mapel Bloomberg, and I am Professor of Women's Studies at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I also hold the Hamline University Endowed Chair in the Humanities. Today, I present the lecture, To Add a Glory to the Common Life, 19th Century Methodism and Women's Collegiate Education, which is based in part on research that was completed for the article 19th Century Methodists and Coeducation, The Case of Hamline University, which was published in the October 2008 edition of Methodist History. That article is available for download from the General Commissions on Archives and History of the United Methodist Church via the Methodist History Journal at archives.gcah.org. Inherited from his mother Susanna, who believed in educating both her daughters and sons, John Wesley believed in education and its use as a tool for social reform. In the mid-19th century, American Methodists answered the need for collegiate and college preparatory education. Their schools were created with a specific social project in mind, namely, to create a literate body of rational, evangelical Christian women and men who would provide moral and spiritual leadership needed in American society. The Methodist project of higher education focused on settlements along the emerging western frontier, where the need for colleges was greater and class mobility more rapid. Methodists were also intent on bringing religion, morality, and literacy to what some believed was the disorder of the frontier and a population ripe for evangelizing. Methodist Episcopal Bishop Leonidas L. Hamline, the man responsible for providing the initial funding for Hamline University, believed that the frontier was an appropriate place for establishing a new church-sponsored institution of higher learning. He said, "Female education is exciting unprecedented interest in the West, and conventions and colleges of teachers are discussing it with extreme earnestness and zeal." He said that in 1840. A few years later then, in 1854, the eponymous Hamline University was established at the eastern edge of Minnesota Territory under the auspices of the Methodist Episcopal Church. In order to explore the ideas foundational to the Methodist support of coeducation, we need to turn to the Ladies' Repository, the Methodist Journal for Women published between 1841 and 1878, which featured the writings of prominent Methodist men who were in favor of women's equal participation in the Methodist Episcopal project of social leadership and reform. The Ladies' Repository was a monthly periodical based in Cincinnati and produced by the Methodist Episcopal Church. It was devoted to the literature, arts, and doctrines of Methodism and contained a variety of content, such as articles, poetry, fiction, engravings, etc. Its founding editor was Bishop Hamline, who held that post from 1841 to 1844. 19th century Methodists underscored rationality and social functionality in learning, distinguishing it from women's ornamental education in needlework, music and dancing, reading, and the study of French or Italian designed to prepare young women for marriage. This type of education was, in the Methodist view, simply a waste of women's intellectual and spiritual powers, condemning her to a sinful life of disuse and rendering her incapable of understanding the dynamic complexities of God's world and the place of humans in it. Publishing in the Ladies' Repository, Caleb Atwater argued, he was a Reverend Caleb Atwater, he argued that the practice of decorative female education that teaches women only to, quote, play on the harp, the guitar, and the pianoforte, to draw figures on paper or cloth with a painter's brush or a needle, to dance the waltz, walk gracefully on their toes, make a handsome courtesy, keep an album, sing a fashionable song, wear corsets, false curls, and artificial flowers, hold a silly conversation on nothing, leer and look languishing, and act the fool, should itself and the women it produces be, quote, driven out of the land as a, quote, disgrace to this enlightened age. Reverend Atwater obviously had some opinions about this. And in justification for his opinion, He firmly noted the, quote, fact that females are as capable of attaining all sorts of knowledge as the other sex, and as a result, quote, the main objects of educating females are precisely the same as those of educating the other sex, to develop all their powers and faculties, and to prepare them for lives of happiness and usefulness. Methodists writing in the Ladies' Repository believed women's coeducation would ennoble both sexes. By expanding women's role as the moral and spiritual center of the family into a similar location in the college environment, Methodists identified the important role of women as civilizers in an institution specifically designed to civilize the secular communities on the Western frontier. The Reverend P.S. Donaldson, who for a time was president of the Ohio Wesleyan Female College, contended that women's education is, quote, necessary to man. They who are united in life must assimilate in character. And, because a woman's power was far-reaching, he believed it was incumbent upon her to help steer the family ship and counsel its captain. Indeed, Atwater argued, quote, men of liberal minds and true politeness enthusiastically prefer, a learned woman as their wife, companion, and friend, and for the mother of their children. By structuring the environment of coeducational collegiate education on the institution of the family, Methodists extended the gender domain of the home and family into the college, purposefully expanding and legitimizing women's sphere. They capitalized on the 19th century cult of domesticity that understood the middle-class family as the institutional foundation of society and the locus for creating the actors who would transmit moral value into the social order. Thus, Methodists purposely expanded the structural idea of the family into the social space of the college, creating a powerful argument for coeducation by noting that the separation of the sexes in the classroom violated the natural order of the family and society, where men and women already work together toward common goals. Now let's hear from Methodist Bishop E.O. Haven, and you might recognize his name in that for a time he was also president of the University of Michigan, of Northwestern University, and Syracuse University before becoming bishop. Bishop Haven insisted it was, quote, a great mistake to separate the sexes, causing, quote, division where there ought to be union. Reflecting on the discord that can come from the illogical arrangement of the sexes, he observes, we see this in attending to a separation of men and women into distinct, if not rival bodies, in the establishment of female schools instead of entering the schools already existing, and in the establishment of female societies to accomplish the end already sought by existing societies. What a misfortune it would be to have male churches and female churches, he said. Indeed, if women could learn from the Word of God while sitting in the same pews as men, why couldn't they also learn from the disciplines of history, science, and mathematics in a similar way? These progressive Methodists believed educated women were better prepared to serve society as moral citizen leaders and, if needed, support themselves economically. Thus, collegiate education was a practical way for women to be prepared for a wide range of social possibilities, while at the same time legitimized a pathway for women to participate in the Methodist evangelical plan that put them to work in the secular world. The new America being built along the edges of westward expansion needed men and women who could be prepared for any number of social, economic, and moral possibilities, and all hands were expected to contribute. As historian Linda Kerber points out, quote, the Republic did not need fashion plates. It needed citizens, women as well as men, of self-discipline and strong mind. Called to be useful in their evangelism, an ever-growing body of middle-class Methodist women took up this responsibility by claiming an education that in turn allowed them to participate robustly in and even ascend to leadership positions in various social reform efforts. And young women especially those residing along America's western edge, affirmed collegiate education as a necessary step on their path of evangelism and social reform, for they too would be makers of the nation. As educational opportunities became available, women seized them, and one of those places that opened its doors to women on an equal basis with men was Hamline University. Hamline University was among the first dozen coeducational Methodist colleges in the United States, granting classical and scientific college degrees to both women and men enrolled in the same program. During Hamline University's first decade, from 1859 to 1869, nearly 70% of its graduates were women who earned a degree of A.B., or Arterum Baccalaureatus, which is similar to today's Bachelor of Arts. Of those women, more than a quarter were eventually granted the degree of A.M., or Artium Magister, similar to today's Master of Arts. It's important to note here that Hamline's proportion of women students at this time far exceeded the national average. In its first decades, Hamline University granted about 7 degrees to women students for each 3 men students. Like the majority of Methodist colleges and universities, Hamline University practiced a non-sectarian admissions policy and focused its curriculum on classical collegiate subjects in order to simultaneously evangelize unconverted scholars and prepare the converted for further work in the secular world. Hamline had a robust curriculum in classical subjects such as philosophy, chemistry, history, rhetoric, Greek, and music. And the Sentinel, which was Red Wing's local paper, praised Hamline for the physical plan of the college specifically designed to serve a coeducational student population. And here's what the Sentinel had to say about Hamline University. The present accommodations are excellent for the proper teaching of both sexes, with laboratory, chapel, library and reading rooms, schoolroom, recitation rooms, rooms for drawing, painting, music, etc., with competent teachers in all branches. It is designed that every pupil, male and female, shall have a thorough and complete education, affording the ladies the same facilities and advantages with the gentlemen. And that's from 1856 in the Red Wing Sentinel. Hamline prided itself on creating an educational atmosphere acceptable to the parents of the best young women and men of the New Northwest. For example, Hamline's university catalog for 1857 to 1858 underscored the Methodist approach to coeducation that emulated the institution and values of the family. It read, "Each student will be expected to conform in every respect to the laws which should always govern gentlemen and ladies. It is believed that the blending of the sexes in the process of education is the natural and reasonable method. It conforms more to the family institution than any other plan." After leaving Hamline to go out into the world, its first graduates led lives of leadership and service, and the widely scattered evidence of their lives provides a glimpse of the impact of this first generation of coeducated Methodist women had on their world. Shaped by their religious values and their Hamline education, each in her own way contributed to the Methodist projects of religious evangelism, education, and social reform. Importantly, none chose to become missionaries, favoring instead to be of use in the secular world in its parlors, classrooms, and newsrooms. So let's learn about some of those first graduates. Our first graduating class was made up of Elizabeth and Emily Soren. Elizabeth Soren was not only a lifelong educator, but she also helped to replicate the Hamline coeducational experiment. After graduation, she continued as a teacher. Her appointments included preceptress of Upper Iowa University in Fayette, Iowa, which was a newly established coeducational Methodist institution, the idea for which was proposed by a Methodist pioneer woman. In 1864, Elizabeth worked with her father, the Reverend Matthew Soren, one of the original trustees of Hamline University, to found another Methodist Episcopal school named the North Missouri Male and Female Institute, located in Louisiana, Missouri, Emily Robertson Soren Meredith had her work take root in the social and political worlds. She married Frederick A. Meredith, an early proprietor of the newspaper in Red Wing called The Republican. Emily and Frederick believed in the power of educated, politically active, evangelical citizenry to help shape the nation, and perhaps for this reason, they left Red Wing for the West. The Merediths eventually settled in Denver, where Emily contributed to the Rocky Mountain News, which was edited by her husband. In addition to her writing, Emily participated in a variety of reform organizations, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other women's clubs, and with her daughter Ellis, rose to prominence as a leader in the Western women's suffrage movement, and thus helped Colorado become the second state to grant women full suffrage. Later, Emily and Ellis authored a chapter detailing the events of the Colorado suffrage movement for the history of women's suffrage. The work of the members of Hamline University's second graduating class might not have been as public as the work of the first, but these women nonetheless impacted society. For example, following her graduation, Sarah Williams served as a teacher in St. Paul, and in 1863 married businessman William R. Noble. Sarah later engaged in club work and used her Hamline education, for example, to lead women's literary study of Robert Browning. Mary Soren Crary also married soon after graduation. 1 year after commencement, in June 1861, Mary was united in marriage with the Reverend Benjamin F. Crary, then president of Hamline University. The marriage was a good match, for Crary had recently suffered the tragic loss of his wife. Like her sisters, Mary did not remain in Red Wing long after graduation. By turns, she and her family supported her husband's religious work in St. Louis, Missouri, where Crary accepted an appointment as editor of the Central Christian Advocate, which was an influential Methodist newspaper. They then went to Colorado, where Crary was appointed presiding elder of the Colorado Conference. And finally, they arrived in California upon his appointment as editor of the California Christian Advocate. In 1894, Crary's poor health required his wife Mary, for a short time, to take over the editorial duties of the Advocate after the earnest solicitation of the California Conference ministers. The accounts of Hamline University's first graduates show that Hamline women were not content to stay solely within the confines of the home. Their education was designed to make them useful and get them out into the world to make it a better place. For an education from Hamline University, according to its 1854 mission statement, was designed to, quote, provide knowledge, values, and skills to those who wish to prepare for a life of leadership and service to their society and the world. Like Elizabeth, Emily, Mary, and Sarah, later women graduates used their education in a variety of ways. They became wives and mothers with active volunteer and reform commitments. They also pursued careers as teachers in elementary and secondary schools, as principals and superintendents, as professors and preceptresses in normal schools, colleges, and university, as graduate students, librarians, businesswomen, missionaries, newspaper editors, and reporters. And by the early 20th century, Hamline's women graduates could be found in every occupation available to women. In 1859, Hamline University believed that graduates Elizabeth and Emily Soren were only the first of thousands that would follow in their train. An extraordinary belief bolstered by faith and purpose that has survived for more than a century and a half to see those thousands of graduates at work making the world a better place. Certainly, the strokes of the pen in 1854 that allowed for the creation of an institution of learning for the education of youth of both sexes has profoundly affected generations of women and men who have passed through Hamline's doors that were opened by those first intrepid graduates. Coeducation was one of the ways Methodism influenced the 19th century educational and social landscape and created a group of educated evangelical women who used the fruits of coeducation to engage the secular world, and by doing so, helped to develop a new consciousness regarding women's place in society and social reform. Thus, Methodist women's coeducation became a vehicle for an expanded notion of public social relations between women and men, which, enacted successfully on college campuses, became institutionalized and absorbed into social practice.